Okay, welcome back from coffee, or probably more likely spending your time in the lift for the last half hour. My name's Angus Candy. I'll be chairing this session on technology and sustainability, kill or cure. So it's quite a straightforward issue to decide which side you're on, except of course it's not. Tata Consultancy Services have very kindly helped us put this session together. It's not just about internet services, though that's certainly an example we'll be discussing. This issue, I suppose, has been helpfully very much in the public eye this week with Owen Paterson, the Environment Secretary's attack on the wicked NGO opponents of GM crops, which I'm sure we will discuss, but it does quite neatly package up the issues between the promises of technology and science to address issues in the world, and what some people will see as the rather less promising reality when technology is put to use in the world. And it's that relationship between the two. Are there trade-offs that we have to make or when we implement technology, or are there some technologies that we should just draw the line at? Is technology a fix, a cure-all for environmental problems, for example, or something that itself sometimes comes with too high a cost? And crucially, I suppose, who decides on these issues? Who do we leave these decisions to? I'm not going to say any more of this. You probably know the format by now. We've got 5 on the panel, so I've asked them to restrict their opening comments to maybe 5 minutes each, not more than 5 minutes each. And they're going to I'll introduce them now in the order that they're going to speak. So my far left, Shahin Ramifard, who's a professor of sustainable engineering at Loughborough University, but he's also the founder and director of SMART, the Centre for Sustainable Manufacturing and Recycling Technologies, which looks at the issues of sustainability through the whole product life cycle, from R&D to shrink wrapped and unwrapped on your shelf. Second to speak on my right, we've got Dr. Natasha McCarthy, Head of Policy at the Royal Academy of Engineering. She's the author of Engineering: A Beginner's Guide, a member of the Forum for Philosophy, Engineering and Technology Steering Committee, and previously, if that wasn't enough, was also a lecturer in the philosophy of science, logic and Wittgenstein at the University of St Andrews. Third, on my immediate left, is Ken MacLeod, a science fiction writer, including The Restoration Game and Intrusion, a new book I believe just gone to the printers. He's also the writer in residence in the MA Creative Writing programme at Edinburgh Napier University. Fourth up, next to Natasha on my right, is Martin Wright. Martin's the founding editor of the Green Futures magazine, which is probably the world's best known leading magazine on the question of sustainable futures. He's a prolific journalist and commentator, and also the visiting judge for the Ashton Awards for Sustainable Energy. And last but not least, on my far right, Dr. Norman Lewis, who's the Director in Innovation at PricewaterhouseCoopers, another one of the Apple Ideas sponsors. He's the co-author of Big Potatoes, the London Manifesto for Innovation, and has very wide, long time experience in technology adoption, especially in the telecom space. We all give the panelists a round of applause. We might as well just dive in, get us going.
Thank you, Agnes. Good afternoon, everybody. Technology and sustainability, Q or Q? Technology and sustainability, kid or Q? Which side am I? For somebody who's been involved for the last 25 years developing technology as an engineer, I suppose the answer is very clear. And I want to kind of qualify this though by the title of my chair in Loughborough as a sustainable engineer. Because I've always been quizzed about this. What is a sustainable engineer? You know, when we talk about mechanical engineer, manufacturing engineer, which is by training what I am, people seem to know clearly what it is, but what's a sustainable engineer? And my answer always is one that actually uses a common sense a bit more often, and the other is that it doesn't think that technical feasibility and economical sustainability are the only issues you consider in any project. You consider the other two bottom lines of environment and social issues. So, technology, is it good or bad? The way that typically humans are sort of separated from animals is the use of tools. Technologies are needed to generate this tool. One of the very first tools we've ever developed is a sharp object to help us cut things. These days, commonly referred to a knife. If you look at the evolutionary design of the knife, it's an amazing thing. So, what has it been used now? And is it good or bad thing? If you look at it at the hand of a surgeon, it preserves life. If you look at it at the hand of a chef, it adds to the quality and enjoyment of life, as is quite clear. If you look at it at the hand of a robber, it's a way of extracting money and things that doesn't belong to him. And even worse, if you have a look at the hand of a murderer, is for taking life. So is it a technological issue, it's about the design of life, or is it about the way that we use technology? So you may actually say, well, what are the challenges in ensuring to use the technology in the right way? Clearly, I would say education is the very first priority. Lots of things to discuss about that. Hopefully, we will come back into it. But more importantly, when you look at ways that technology has been taken out of its original context, is where it's been used as a means of profit making. I was in the previous sessions. There was a great debate about difference between capitalism and monopolism. And when you're using technology purely for profit-making situation, it looks like that we always come up with either products or ways that increases consumption without adding value. I mean, the final thing about the things on talking about technology in terms of whether we should decide it's a good or bad thing, I think we've got to start thinking about in our approach to making decisions, in our approach, in our thinking, we've got to be global and think that, right, the issue of GM was talked about. As people living in developed societies have no problem in accessing to food, and our children is not suffering from hungers and different things, we may actually develop a point of view. But from the point of view of people living in some of the poorer countries who are suffering very badly, then you have a different perspective to this technology. So in general, when we're making a final decision, I think we have to be global in our thinking. Earth is in one country and humanity is its citizen. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Natasha?
Thank you very much. Yes. So as mentioned, before working in the area of engineering, I was a philosopher. And one thing I think philosophers and engineers have in common is that they really like a good dilemma. And what appealed to me about this session, especially in the sort of description of it online, was the number of dilemmas that were set out. You know, you have technologies that can give us a huge promise. So, for example, shale gas can give us huge new resources of gas that can help to address our energy needs and hopefully make energy a little bit cheaper. But of course, there are unknowns about the risks of shale gas and fracking. And there's also the problem, of course, that if we stick with shale gas, we're stuck with fossil fuels, and we know the risks attached to that. If you look at something like big data, you know, there's fantastic opportunities with big data. We can learn an awful lot about the genesis of disease and the predictors of disease, and hopefully find new ways of treating disease. But the kinds of big data you need for that application are very much personal data, data that is about individuals and their most private aspects of their lives. So there's risks in using that kind of data. So there's dilemmas about all technologies, and as Shaheen just said, you know, every technology can be put to multiple uses. So whilst it's not very easy to say, you know, technology is good or bad, we have to sort of make some decisions. So what do we do when we want to make some sort of practical decision about a way forward in engineering? How do we deal with these sorts of dilemmas? Well, despite the fact that the general view of philosophy is that they actually like to toss a dilemma around for several centuries and keep playing with it until it's absolutely exhausted. In fact, the philosophers have come up with a nice tool for dealing with the problem of inaction when you're faced with this kind of practical dilemma. And back in the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas coined what's called the principle of double effect. If you do something that's ostensibly wrong, if it has an impact that is actually very good, then you can be justified for taking this wrong action. And a really nice black and white example is, suppose you're threatened by a robber who might kill you, might kill your family. Do you kill him and defend yourself? Well, obviously killing someone's wrong, but the double effect of your killing him is to save yourself and save your family. So there's a nice principle that the philosophers found to kind of cut through these dilemmas where you've got a potential stalemate. And I think in the dilemmas of technology, this principle of double effect has a real application, because we are in a risk of real stalemate at the moment. We're talking about, very general actually here, about the march of technology and progress in technology. Should we be going forward with technology? Should we be putting limitations on it? You know, are we at risk of going to places that we're not happy with? Well, I think actually it's not an option to sit back and not pursue technologies. We're in a crisis situation in terms of our use of resources, our use of energy. We have significant constraints on the economy, and living the way we do is not sustainable in the long term. So we do have to pursue new ways forward. Of course, one way forward is to live differently, to use less resource, to use less energy, to rethink the way we live our lives. But personally, I'm not hugely confident that a mass large-scale change in behaviour is a real possibility. So therefore we have to kind of look to shape the technologies that support our ways of life and find new ways of developing these technologies and new ways of supporting our ways of life. And it's not just about ways of life, it's about ways of making a living. You know, developing new technology is a huge part of our economy in this country and globally. So moving forward with technology is absolutely essential. And if that has downsides, then let's appeal to our principle of double effect. But unfortunately, that's not the really hard dilemma. The hard dilemma is not about do we march forward with technology or do we sit back and be a bit more cautious. The real dilemma is which technology to choose for which problem. And sometimes we can really be stuck, you know, between a rock and a hard place. If you look at our needs for transport, which are ever growing, do we look to produce more, build more airports, build more runways to allow short haul flights, or do we look at building more roads and more railways? Well, obviously, both options there have their opponents, and there's no clear answer. There's so many questions like this in technology, so we have huge needs for energy. Do we look to renewable energies? Well, lots of opponents of things like wind, there's lots of concern about the immaturity of new renewable technologies. Do we look at CCS to help mitigate the effects of fossil fuels? Well, obviously that's immature. Do we look at nuclear? Well, obviously there's huge concerns about the risks of nuclear energy and the problem of storage of the waste. So what we've really got here is a set of very practical dilemmas. And this is where our nice philosophical principle runs out, and we need to turn to the engineer and their own particular way of dealing with the dilemmas of technology. So what I think we need to do now is we need to think like an engineer. So that means taking every dilemma of technology on its own basis. Don't try and have one ideological response. Think about that problem as part of a system that's about the technology, the economic context, the users, the communities that use them, and consult with all those people. Think about all elements of that system. Don't have one silver bullet, don't hope one solution will work. Diversify, invest in a range of technologies, and test them and prototype, and make sure we know the risks and we can manage the risks before we march forward. So in sum, I think, yes, we can't say no to technology. It's not technology or sustainability. We need technology for sustainability, and if there are downsides, I think we can appeal to a justification. But what we really need to do is have a good engineering response to deal with the really detailed dilemmas of how we create a sustainable future.
Well, thanks, Natasha. I mean, I think that's a very useful way of kind of packaging up the problem that we are addressing today, maybe better than I did, which is, you know, the ends on one level might justify the means, you know, kill the robber and save your family. But if the means are setting off a nuclear explosion in your house, it may be counterproductive. So how do you decide? Ken, your take on this dilemma?
Yeah, well, as a science fiction writer, I'm supposed to think out of the box and take the long view. So, in terms of a science fictional perspective, sustainability may mean something a little different to what it means to most of the panel here. Like, we do tend to worry about that ever-expanding black hole at the centre of the galaxy. I mean, what's the long-term, what does that imply for our long-term future? Okay, sustainable, as the economist David Friedman, son of the more famous Milton, pointed out, does not, obviously can't mean that we can go on doing whatever it is we're doing forever. But does anyone think it does? I think there's a problem with the idea of sustainability because it's extended often seems to be extended beyond its natural use, as it were, into areas of thought where it's a little less plausible. The place where the idea of sustainability comes from is the idea of sustainable yield, hunting, gathering and fishing in a way that doesn't deplete the population of plants or animals or fish or whatever being exploited. Now that makes an obvious degree of sense most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't apply. Sometimes a forest just has to be felled. We wouldn't retrospectively thank the inhabitants of pre-Roman Britain if they'd used the forest that covered this island sustainably, because it would still be here and we wouldn't. But we can regret that our more recent ancestors didn't use the whales sustainably, and our parents, in fact us, in the case of people my age, didn't use the fish population sustainably. But some necessary processes are unsustainable in the sense that you can't continue them forever, and that's a good thing. If you take minerals out of the ground, they don't get replaced, except over extremely long geological timescales. But even mineral extraction can be sustainable in a certain sense, because the progress that it makes possible enables ever more clever use of resources and finding more resources, forcing us to economize on resources as they run down or become hard to extract and so on. Which means, for example, that there was more iron ore available in the 20th century to mining than there was in the 19th, and certainly a lot more was available in the 20th century than there was in the 17th. Because more iron ore means you can make the machinery to dig deeper mines, to automate them, and so on, and thus more iron ore becomes accessible. And this same logic applies to many other non-renewable resources. Radically disruptive technologies, like atomically precise manufacturing, which is what Eric Drexler, who invented the concept, now calls what used to be called nanotechnology, can make a lot of pollution and waste and spoil and rust back into harmless and usable material. Even with present day technology, we already know that space is Earth's best friend, not just in saving us from asteroid impacts, but in massively increasing the efficiency of our daily lives through such things as accurate weather forecasting, navigation, ground observation lets us see what's happening to forests, fields, the weather, etc., etc. So I think in the long run, what my idea of an ultimately sustainable society would be is where everyone in the world has first world problems. I think that would be progress.
Excellent, thank you very much, Ken. And Marshall, you've sustained yourself.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so technology and sustainability kill or cure? The short answer, obviously, is both. Wrong kind of technology applied in the wrong ways, in the wrong amounts, is killing our chances of being sustainable. But I say the right kind of technology can not only help us be sustainable, but I go further, we don't have a cat's hell chance of keeping our way of life going, let alone of progress, without harnessing the power of technological innovation. Just to tease out a few, maybe rather creakingly general points, so I think it's quite useful to frame the discussion. What is sustainability, apart from a god-awful boring word? Sustainability is simply the ability to keep going, the ability to take things forward into the future. What are we keeping going? Our way of life, in broad terms. That's broadly what we want to keep going. Most people don't want to have a radical revolution in their way of life. They want things to carry on and preferably get a bit better. Now, our way of life depends on a number of things that we need. We need water, we need food, we need heat, we need light, we need motive power, manufacturing power, power to enjoy ourselves. And ever since we crawled out from the Rift Valley, we've used technology to get some of those benefits. And the trouble is, as people have touched on, some of the ways we're doing so, some of the ways we're using technology is now threatening the ability to keep that way of life going. Pollution, resource depletion, including fairly fundamental things like soil and water, and of course climate change, which hasn't gone away just because the Daily Telegraph says it has. So some of the ways we're using technology is causing us to bump up against these natural limits. How do we respond to it? Well, I think there are broadly three ways. The first way I'd argue is where most of certainly government is at the moment, not just in the UK and elsewhere, which is denial, sticking your fingers in the ears and pretending there isn't a really, really serious, pressing political problem. The second way to respond is a sort of a shrink-to-fit response, a slightly sort of scaredy cat response, where we try to limit ourselves, constrain ourselves. It's a narrative which appeals to some environmentalists, partly because they use it as a proxy to attack stuff they don't like capitalism or consumerism. But I think the third response, the more encouraging response, is to see constraints, the constraints we're bumping up against, as a spur to innovation. In other words, that there may be planetary limits, but there are no limits on human ingenuity. And that's where the more interesting longhand version of sustainability comes in, which is sustainable development. And that's another god-awful boring phrase, I agree. But it does at least have a reasonably coherent definition. A colleague of mine, Sarah Parkin at Forum for the Future, gave the best definition of sustainable development I've heard, which is that it's a dynamic process which allows everyone to reach their full potential, enjoy a decent quality of life without destroying the life support systems on which all life depends. So the key thing in that is this is about development. This is not a philosophy of stasis of standing still. This is about doing more, doing better. So the limits are real, but the limits can unleash a wave of innovations which we have to adopt if we're going to live well within those limits. And that they're starting to happen. Some of the most exciting innovations, if any technologies, are ones which are pushing us, or have the potential to push us down the sustainability path. There's a huge amount going on in energy, third generation biofuels, solar, organic solar, spray-on solar, new materials in construction, concentrated solar power, the energy internet, etc., etc. There's a whole list of things that are actually happening which have an enormous potential to shove us down the sustainability path. We do need to make sure that we have the right conversations about technology. So some things technology does really well, other things politics does better. So if you want to feed the world, yes, GM might play a role. If you can have drought-tolerant, saline-tolerant crops, and this is all in the promise, this isn't actually happening at the moment, whatever the Environment Secretary might say, but it would be very, very hard to argue against that. But more urgently, you need to tackle issues like land tenure, distribution, who can sell what to whom at what price, how to reform supply chains so that, for example, in India, 1/3 of the harvest doesn't spoil before it gets to market, which happens at the moment. Interestingly enough, part of the solution to that, as well as the political and market reforms which needs to happen, is a much more down-to-earth form of technology, refrigeration. Solar-powered fridges in the villages, small-scale refrigeration trucks that can take the produce out from the villages to the market before it spoils. So we need to be wary of equating technology always with something that's newer and shinier and more expensive. Some technologies are brilliant just as they are. I got here on a bicycle. As a technology for getting around town, for an efficient way of translating energy to motive power, it's very, very hard to beat. It's an example of that lovely, another worthy phrase, appropriate technology, which can sound very patronising when it's applied to places like Africa or India. People can feel that if you get excited about an improved cook stove design in India, you're somehow condemning people to missing out on the wider riches of the 21st century, while the truth is an improved cook stove can be the biggest single transformation that anyone could hope for. Mind you, so is a smartphone. And you've got improved cook stoves and smartphones going hand in glove across whole swathes of villages in Africa and India because of the money that people save on fuel costs thanks to an improved cook stove, they can afford a smartphone. So I think when it comes around to it, sort of come to a conclusion, when it comes to whether any technology is kill or cure, a simple, maybe rather oversimplistic, but a necessary question to ask is this going to help us live well within natural limits? And it's easy to ask, it's tough to answer, but it does at least provide something of a framework for the conversation.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And Norman, your thoughts?
Thank you. Well, there's much that has been said that I do agree with. There's much that I would question, but what I'd like to do is just step back slightly and just try and interrogate this question of sustainability in relation to technology a little more carefully, because I think that we really have to try and understand what's underpinning this discussion. And whilst it's a discussion that always seems to be, is it kill, is it cure, can we find a balance, are there natural limits or whatever, I think that the fundamental thing that has occurred, and I'd love to hear what everybody's got to say about this, is that what really underpins this discussion today is that I think we as a society and a culture have become very uncomfortable with uncertainty. That our orientation to the future is one which is beset by very pessimistic outlooks. So what we find in the kind of methodology underpinning this is this kind of projection into the future from what we're doing at present with our current state of knowledge and current state of technology. And we kind of calculate on the basis of that 2050 there's going to be 9.5 billion people. If we continue to consume energy in the way that we do, we're going to run out of this fuel, we're going to run out of this fossil or whatever. And what it doesn't take into account, and incidentally, I think what also happens then is that we read history backwards, because we don't really understand that technologies are not linear objects that have a kind of finite beginning and a finite end, and that we can somehow say at this point in time, this technology should be stopped or its outcomes have been negative or positive. Technologies are, I would call, they're similar to, they're almost like living microsystems. They evolve over time, they involve the connections between things in ways that are constantly undergoing change. When a technology emerges, the intent, and I'm sure the engineers on this panel would agree with me, the intention always then is to try and make them more efficient. And in the process of making them more efficient, new things are discovered, other parts or elements or components come into being, which bring into play other technologies and impacts outside of the specific sphere that technology is working within. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm trying to get at is that you cannot look at technology and try and plan technology in a way that I think a lot of the discussion around technology and sustainability comes down to. Because yes, we can say we want to mitigate risks, and of course, as human beings and as being ingenious as we are, nobody's advocating that we should just blindly go into anything and just apply anything. We should always try and quantify and understand what the potential outcomes of things might be, with the understanding that you can never plan what all the outcomes are going to be. Technology and the evolution, the history of technology has never been that. Wherever one technology began and what it subsequently became are completely different. And there's a kind of path of development and interaction that I think is critical to understand. And if you take something like the internet or information technology, look at computation. It really began in the 1940s largely as an aid to scientific calculation for wartime purposes. That's where it began. It then evolved later in the post-war period with large mainframes and all of that, into commerce and accounting. But at the same time, if you look at what happened in telecoms and the evolution of transmission across wires or whatever, the two coming together meant that you actually had something completely different emerge from that, which was the internet, which was the system that now impacts not just the military, not just impacts the particular industries where this came across, but now impacts the entire realm of the economy, of society, of every aspect of our social life. Genetic engineering began as a minor offshoot of its parent fields of molecular biology and biochemistry. Where did we end up with that? We ended up with developing techniques for performing tasks that previously only nature could perform. So we've developed an incredible capacity as a consequence of that. In other words, what I'm saying is that if your concern is uncertainty, you can only deal with uncertainty in two ways. You can either want guarantees at the outset, which can only mean that you try and restrain what you do. You kind of limit, you accept the limits that are posed to you, not see them as problems that have to be solved. Or you innovate. You look for new knowledge. You deal with uncertainty by yourself becoming a champion of change. And I believe that it's that what we are excellent at. And whatever problems are being stored up with the stupid way and the inefficient way that we use energy today, we will find a solution to that, because I infinitely believe, and I don't know how many of you will share this, that mankind is not the problem, it's the solution. The scarcest resource that we have on this planet is what's between our ears. It's our imaginations. And if your attitude towards change is one that you don't want risks, that you want guarantees that there's not going to be unexpected outcomes, then what you're really doing is you're limiting our capacity to innovate and our capacity to develop new knowledge, develop new technologies, find new solutions, etc. That's what so in my estimation, I think technology is a solution, but I think it's human ingenuity and the application of human ingenuity that will actually solve this problem. Thank you.
Can I start by bringing maybe where Norman has finished back to you, Natasha, first of all, and the problem, as I read it, you might call it the leap or not to leap question in a way. So Owen Paterson, despite his condemnation of the NGOs, is not leaping. He said nobody should leap with golden rice and GM crops until science has proven that it's absolutely safe. So he's sort of having a pop at the NGOs, but not deciding to go ahead and leap. So I mean, it's a question that people face with penicillin. You know, people were dying of septicemia, and somebody had to say, let's go with penicillin. We're not absolutely sure yet, but we're going to do this. The thing is, with a great leap forward, you end up somewhere that's not explained in terms of where you jumped from. But that's a very big leap, and sometimes we make them. How do you decide to jump?
It's a very difficult question because, especially, so I'm particularly interested in engineering, and that's the kind of technology that only really exists in application. You can do technology research, you can test concepts out, you can model them, but a real engineering system is only tested in use. It's only tested when it interacts with people, when it interacts with the environment. So a leap is always a necessary part of testing out an engineering system. And we did a report on shale gas, and one of the things we said was that, well, actually, some of the questions about shale gas will only be fully known through starting to do some hydraulic fracturing. We'll only find out the real risks by doing it. But the question is then, okay, it's a leap, but there's a big leap and there's a little leap. You know, you can try one. So you can try one test. You can do fracking in one locale. You don't need to sort of roll it out as a new energy policy and say we're going to do this. We're going to sort of roll it across the UK. So it's not always a wholesale leap into a technology. There is a way of sort of testing and trying out on a small basis, but it is by nature risky, and it's risky because it happens in the real world amongst people. And that's the other aspect of it. So whilst we've sort of framed this as technology and people, and what can technology do, what can people do, obviously people's views on technologies are really important. So it's not just about understanding the technological risk, it's not just about assessing the risk, it's about engaging with people on a broad scale, broad society, and it's about engaging with people who will be immediately affected by trying out a new technology, and that's just got to be an essential part of it. And obviously that doesn't give you a clear answer, but it is an essential part of making that leap, is ensuring that you've at least discussed, you've debated, and you've consulted with the people affected.
Shahin, can I bring you in on that question? Because in your opening thoughts you were saying that there were some leaps that might be made just to make money, just for profit-making motives, and that we might have out-of-control knife production, that people are stockpiling knives and there's no value added. But from this take, it's maybe more that through that process of actually going out and doing things, we'll find the use. And this is a bit to Ken's point as well, that we have got more iron ore because we dug up more. And is there a virtuous circle? Do you see that possibility?
I think for me, the best way to answer this is to use what Norman was saying, that one of our biggest assets, one of the biggest resources is what's between our ears in terms of our innovation, our thinking. I'm not so sure it's possible to actually stop any technology to develop. I'll exemplify this. I ran a sort of module for some of our students on sustainable product design. I give them a product, I get them to disassemble it, asking them to look at everything. But mischievously, I always ask them, forget about economical and social issues. Just consider environmental issues and come back and say, how can we improve the environmental impact of this product? Almost every year, almost every group comes back and says, you know, and I always achieve the objective of trying to stop something, because if you try to do that, in any way it amplifies it. You say, you ask us not to have a look at the social things, but I think it's impossible. And you ask us not to have a look at the economical side of things, but I think it's impossible. And then I'll thank them to say, well, I'll make my point, that sustainability is about the three bottom lines, not one. So this idea of leaping and not leaping, you know, we don't live in an independent society, we live in a global society. There are many aspects of technology that is kind of being developed in collaboration, in conjunction with different governments and so on. There is such a thing called a precautionary principle. This was developed as part of one of the Earth Summit. The idea was that lack of scientific evidence should not stop us doing a cost-effective, measured response to irreversible changes. When you take that into consideration, I agree that without having elementary kind of confidence in technology, we shouldn't just have a scenarios of black and white from GM to non-GM or from non-GM to GM. But I don't think we should also be afraid, again, as one of the members of the panel said, in taking risk and dealing with uncertainty. So my position on that is leap with a caution, because the cost of not leaping and not progressing is that we may end up in the bigger problems that by then it will be too difficult to deal with.
Can you come in on that, Ken, which is the sort of, you know, if the pre-Roman Britain had looked before it cut down, we wouldn't be here today. So, you know, are you know, to hell with your precautionary principles, or how do you see the balance?
Well, it is a tricky question. My example was fanciful, obviously, but I think we can. I've seen in real life what excessive caution can do on a promising new technology. Quite by chance, I met one of the pioneers of stem cell therapy in Europe, Professor Michele De Luca. And he and his team in Milan, if memory serves, had been doing some very interesting and indeed astonishing work using stem cells to fix eyes, damaged eyes. They could get a complete recovery of a chemically burned eye surface. And cosmetically, functionally, everything, it's perfect. And he had also been doing some promising work with skin grafting, using stem cell developed skin, on people with an extremely rare but extraordinarily distressing syndrome called butterfly baby syndrome, where essentially skin blisters all the time. And he had succeeded in giving functional skin over a large part of one man's arm. And then, that was 10 years ago, his work came to a complete stop because the European Union, in its great wisdom and compassion, had decided that he had to be regulated as if he was a pharmaceuticals factory. So, he and his team, from being a little lab bench operation, had to become a multi-million-dollar factory with 90% of their working time devoted to complying with tests and filling in forms that would have been relevant if they had been a factory producing 1 million tablets a day, and would have no relevance at all to a lab bench producing 1 or 2 delicately cultured cells in a week. And who knows where we could have gone with that. I think this is an excessive, the application of excessive regulation and excessive caution in an extraordinarily promising area.
Martin?
I mean, we are inherently a risky species. We would not have conquered the world as we've done so without being risky. So I always sort of, while I understand the sort of the philosophy behind the precautionary principle, I always shrink from it a little bit because it does have that sort of dead hand of caution on it. I think, interestingly enough, one of the interesting areas in which our affection for risk is working well for us when it comes to sustainable innovations is entrepreneurship. Quite a lot of the most interesting innovations underway are being kickstarted by entrepreneurs who are taking that sort of business risk. So there's an interesting sort of parallel between our inherent wish to take risk and maybe something that will make us safer in the long term.
Maybe let's throw in another example in terms of the internet, because that's something that came with full fanfare of promise, and now people see the sort of more and more articles about the dark net, and you see that kind of dead hand of caution creeping in there, or the idea that the internet drives us to do things we don't want to. I mean, is there no truth to that? I mean, is it just all in our control, or do we sometimes create monsters?
Well, I don't know what you do on the internet. Right, so maybe I shouldn't share that with you, but I think the point is that whether it's the internet or anything else, all technologies can be used for good or for evil, good or bad. Technologies, that's the point I was trying to make, that technologies themselves, and I think this is where we become uncomfortable, especially today, where we are very concerned about uncertain outcomes. The technologies themselves, more often than not, give rise to needs for themselves as technologies, which we don't control. And let me just give you an example of that. If you look at the invention of the automobile in the 1900s, the impact of that, the needs of the development of the automobile, mass production, what that did in terms of the impact it had on steel production, on the evolution of the factory, of the development of roads, of the need for refined petrol, the impact that had on the need for oil exploration, for example, all these things. And the negative impact, for example, that it had on people who up until that time were carriage makers. The anvil, these were technologies that were no longer sustainable. In other words, it wasn't even a Schumpeterian creative destruction. This was an avalanche of destruction. It destroyed all existing craft up until then and transformed the world in that process and gave rise to whole new industries, whole new social relationships as a consequence of that. Now, you couldn't have specified that at the outset. And the point about the precautionary principle, and here, I think that we're being cautious on the panel here. I think it's not like whether we're making leaps or not. I think it's like we want to take a gentle step, but we're going to hold on to the railings and jump back in just in case. The point is that you can't do that. If your principle is that you should not implement something because you don't know and you cannot chart and you cannot measure all the outcomes at the outset, you should not therefore do it, then we will never get beyond where we are now. It hasn't been the principle that has underpinned progress up until this point in time, and it will inhibit progress in the future if we actually use that as an adoption. My final point I just want to make is that the more that we try to ring fence uncertainty, the more it blows up in our face and actually destroys our capacity to adapt to change. So, for example, if you look at something, some very interesting developments around supply chain management. So, for example, in some companies like Nestle, who have this system that they call Sustainable Agricultural Initiative Platform, which is based upon the food standards, hazard analytics and critical control points methodology. Now there's their attempt to try and map the entire supply chain to make sure that everything that in that supply chain is sustainable, can be measured, can be controlled, etc. The interesting thing is that methodology, now I think as an aspiration there's nothing wrong with that, of course, because that can actually have impact on you in your business, etc. But if you look at what's behind it, it's actually based on NASA's total quality management methodology, which they use to put men into space and to go to the moon and come back. The problem with that is that you can have total impact management systems and everything, but a shuttle still blows up. You still get horse meat in burgers. that nobody knew about. In other words, you can try and ring fence and try and take all uncertainty out of things, but that's just not how the world works. And it just means that when that does happen, you kind of create this false expectation within the public that nothing can go wrong, and then when something does go wrong, then somebody has to be to blame, etc. In other words, uncertainty becomes the ruler of our lives. It's a recipe for paralysis. It's not one that actually helps us. And in fact, in that instance, is definitely not sustainable.
Okay, over to you. Don't all leap at once, but I'll take you one at a time, cautiously, starting where are the microphones. We have one microphone, any colour, down at the front. This gentleman in third row up, and the other one starting at the back with the hand on your left. Yes, perfect.
Shall I kick off?
Yes.
I was interested in comments a couple of the panel had about whether or not the very concept of sustainability and the concept of natural limits, the whole idea of it being a self-evident truth, is in fact a pretty wonky concept. And it derives from some fairly silly ways of seeing the world from not so long ago. And what the panel thinks that really does this whole debate. And I tend to side with this gentleman at the end and our writer friend over here on not wanting to see things in the way of sustainability. And I just want the panel to let me know whether or not they think there's a fundamental flaw in this whole debate.
Yeah, we'll start with the big ones. Limits. What limits? Brilliant. So just pass it behind you, and then yes, back with the mic. Yeah.
Okay, so I was just wondering, is it a coincidence that the notion of sustainable development came out at the same time where another very fashionable notion of the end of history came about? Because if you see the definition, sustainable development is supposed to be the development that meets the needs of our generation without compromising the needs of future generations. So the first foul is here, what are the needs of our generation? I'm sure that if I had a debate with George Monbiot, we completely disagree what are the needs of our generation. So second foul, what are the needs of the future generations? And I think why I link it with the end of history, because I think sustainable development sees history as something static. We have today the same needs as we have in some years. And also, I'm a bit of not persuaded by this idea of speaking in behalf of those who are not yet born. Because to me, it seems like we cannot persuade the public who are actually here, so we speak in the name of those who are not here. I just wanted to
Well, I'm glad you're all keeping the questions easy. So what came first, sustainable development or the end of history? So you can pass the mic along to your left, about 4, while you go next.
So my question kind of relates to the one previous. If we do the thought experiment where we believe that it is within our capability to solve all the sustainability problems with technology, a lot of these problems are much more long-term than the problems we've faced previously, and a lot of these sort of political and economic establishments that we have around us prevent us from being incentivized to solve problems which are far in the future. So my question really is, what views do the panel have about practical ways in which we can incentivize politicians and businesses and make them really feel the heat of the fire to solve problems which are far off in the future, when they can never see the returns on their decisions?
Can I ask you to clarify that? Because you're saying the problems we face now are bigger problems than in the past. Maybe they are, but isn't it relative to our ability to do things? So cutting down a forest with a knife is not something. Transforming energy supplies with nuclear power or something else. So can you just clarify what you mean about the scale of our problems?
So I think the scale of our use of resources now is threatening the future ability to have those resources available.
Yeah.
Whereas previously our consumption rates were not threatening our existence in such a way.
So it's too many mouths, sort of question. Pass it back behind you there, and what's up there? People might come back.
I think the risks that we face, our ability to predict the future, I think relative to the individuator's comments about surely our ability to solve problems rises commensurately with the size of those problems, it doesn't. This is a chaotic system. We create ever more powerful and interconnected technologies. In a chaotic system, the more interconnected you are and the more powerful and rapid feedback loops, the less predictable the system. So the point is, as we become more technologically complex, the less predictable the world becomes. And so just one comment, I found it very interesting that you made mention of brains, and that, you know, the great resource that we have is between our ears. Actually, it's our failure to understand brains. We're filling the world with technology, potentially very destructive technology. We don't yet really understand what it takes to make people happy. We're spending money in a lot of the wrong places. We're destroying the planet, and apparently none of this makes us happier. And so, you know, money's being spent in the wrong place. We're living in a chaotic system that we can't control.
Right. We might add to just the back here, just next to you, and then I'll take one more, but three might.
I've just offered an apology. I missed the very first speaker, the very first part of the second speaker. However, in what I did hear, I only heard the word innovation used once. And surely technology in and of itself doesn't solve problems. It's the application of technology. The ability to generate motion from steam existed since ancient Greek times. It's only when people worked out how to harness that it became useful. The SMS started as an engineering tool to solve networks, but then when it was applied in the third world to Indian fishing fleets, it improved people's livelihood because they were able to get timely information and sell their produce for the best price. If we're asking just what is a technology and how do we limit it, are we stopping it being applied in ways we can't yet imagine that might have benefits?
But so we're that mic up there, and we're running down the other one to this man in the blue shirt.
Yes, I'm somewhat surprised that the panelists haven't really addressed in a thorough way, touched on it maybe, the issue of ethics and the way human beings relate to the rest of our fellow creatures. And also try to address the issue that Heidegger raised about technology is not the real problem. The real problem is our belief in the technological understanding of being that's become the ground motive of modernity. It's a sacred theme in our culture. So trying to solve the problem of technology, in a way, it lies outside technology to a degree. It lies with what some people have already suggested here. It lies with our understanding of ourselves as human beings and the way we can be ethically responsible in addressing that problem. Just talking about technology, just stay with technique and using up the resource more efficiently, which is part of the problem.
Okay, thank you. We'll take this one here, and then very brief comeback, not on everything, because we haven't got time, and I can see more hands, but we'll come back out and get you off by then.
Yeah, I thought Norman Lewis's discussion of uncertainty was very useful, because it kind of speaks to the idea that actually there's problems that we actually don't need to solve right now. So, for example, the problem of replacing our current fossil fuels with renewable energy. We could panic and say, actually, we have to do this immediately. We have to, within the next 10 or 20 years, we have to get rid of all fossil fuels and replace them with renewable energies like solar and wind. The problem is at the moment, A, that those things are on the expensive side and they will actually slow society down, and B, it's not a problem we need to solve right this minute. We should have a bit more faith in the idea that we can solve these problems given the passage of time and the intellectual effort to do that. The need to kind of close down and actually solve the problem right now, or stop doing something now because we haven't got the solution, it very much flows from that fact that we're not capable of handling that uncertainty. We're kind of panicking as a result.
So very difficult questions from what limits to Heidegger to what makes us happy, but so don't try by any means to go through them. Just pick the one you like really and keep the ball rolling. Try him first.
Okay, so definition of limits. I always feel that when we kind of consider issues, there is the definition, conceptual development, and then time for action and technology and so on. And in my case, in a view of the sustainable development, I want to compare this into a sort of operation of a factory that makes a very good product, the business is very profitable. If that factory stops there and think about this and say, well, we're making money, what's the need for the next product? What's the need for improving the production? Why we should be forward-looking? I'm sure everybody would agree that they want to stay in business. And even, with a very basic common sense, it's always said that we have to look at our future needs. This goes to the point that was made in here. Do we need to solve the problem now? If you have a look at the life cycle of technologies, for example, renewable technology, it's quite clear that we cannot wait in 20 years and decide we need renewable technology, let's do it now. This type of technology, in terms of development, in terms of implementation, infrastructure, which was the subject of the previous debate, look at electrical cars. At the moment, lots of debates about whether they're good or bad, and whether we should use more of them and not use more of them. I think this is irrelevant, because even if you want to use more of them, we haven't got the infrastructure to do it. So it's not about sort of when we adopt the technology, it's how long we need to sort of develop that technology. And the comment that was out there, trying to find the right application for the technology.
Ken.
Just addressing the question of the connection between the idea of sustainable development and the end of history. I think, having been sort of found myself sustainable beyond the end of history, I do seem to recall that hearing buzzwords about sustainability before history actually came to an end in 1989. So I don't think they came out together. I think that right back into the 1970s and beginning in the 1960s, there was a surge of environmental and ecological concern. And having lived through that period, in fact, in the early 70s, when books like The Survival Handbook, A Blueprint for Survival, and The Population Bomb was on every long-haired lefty student's bookshelf, including mine. I think that there was these ideas had a long genesis. I mean, it is remarkable to reflect that ideas which seem so completely mainstream now were voices crying in the wilderness in 1970, and they were considered cranks and extremists. So, the cranks and extremists of today may take comfort from knowing that their ideas may be hegemonic in 30 years. Or, wait a minute, it's more than 30 years, it's 40 years. I'm older than I thought. But I think that these ideas actually helped to bring about the end of history, because they naturalized our problems. They made us start thinking about problems in terms of humanity having run up against some kind of natural limits to what it could do, limits to growth and so on. And the limits to growth that we saw, or rather the Club of Rome saw in 1974 or whatever it was, that were going to kill us all by the year 2000, or throw us into economic and ecological catastrophe by the year 2000, we actually have gone past without actually noticing.
Can I bring you in on that one, the question of natural limits?
Yeah, sustainability is a wonky concept. I think understanding that we live within physical limits is not a counsel of despair. I think the encouraging thing is our ability to adapt to those. I'd agree with that, but I think having a sort of Pollyanna-ish type of view about, this climate change thing won't really matter, it'll go away, is a bit sort of adolescent, actually. I think I'd pick up Ken's point about, and we can crack things. We don't hear about the ozone layer now. Why don't we hear about the ozone layer? Because basically we sorted the problem. We identified that it would be a big problem having large amounts of UV coming into the atmosphere. Quite a scary problem. We took action, we sorted it. So we can respond to a natural limit, or the threat of a natural limit being breached, in such a way that we have a creative response and we don't constrain our development. I have to come back on the Fukuyama thing, because of course in the Fukuyama we're at the end of history after the downfall of communism, and some of the earliest and most effective protests against communism, ironically, in the Eastern Bloc were against industrial pollution, and some of the protests in Bulgaria in '85 and elsewhere, curiously enough. I absolutely agree with the gentleman who wants to have a pop at the that dreadful Brundtland definition of sustainable development about future generations meeting their own needs. That's why I prefer the one I quoted myself earlier, which is, I say, much more a attitude of progress. I think one other note, but I want to go back to yeah.
Well, just on this sustainability versus end of history, I mean, I think Ken's right. I think this actually this began in the late 60s, early 70s. I think that one of the biggest triggers of this was the oil crisis in the 70s, which really began to make people much more environmentally conscious. There was then a fear, if you remember, the limits to growth, a growing concern about non-renewable energy sources, etc. But it also went hand in hand with a loss of faith in development and the failure in Africa in particular. The reports that came out of Kenya by the ILO in '72 that spoke about the informal sector and to a point that was made earlier about appropriate technology. But basically what that was, it was a shift from development to managing poverty. I mean, that's really what happened. And of course the third strand to all of this, which I think then does definitely inform the end of history kind of thesis, was this kind of ethical reaction against consumer society, against consumerism. And that's all those elements that came together to kind of create this concept, which to be honest, has now become so inculcated in the way that we view things, in our culture, in the assumptions that we make. I mean, who in their right mind would get up and say, well, actually, I'm for unsustainable development? I mean, you know, it's not going to get any brownie points around the dinner table or anywhere else. But in fact, you could argue that unsustainable technology is quite a good thing, i.e. that better technologies displace older technologies, and there is that evolution and that development. I just want to make one quick point about limits. The point that I was trying to make about limits is that it's not that we should have the arrogance of saying, well, we can solve every and any problem, but to understand and recognize that limits are not set in stone. Limits and human needs, for example, are historically determined. What would have met the need for entertainment in the time of the Romans might have been a public spectacle in the Colosseum. But today, we have books, music, films, we have laptops, we have tablets, we have music, we have 1,000 things that we would regard as being necessary to satisfy our human needs. Just remember, this is a story I always love to tell, is the story about quantum physics. Because when Max Planck was going to go into physics, he was told at the time, don't go into physics because everything that we understand about physics has been discovered. There's nothing new to discover. And Max Planck discovered quantum. And we have quantum physics and quantum that has transformed our world. That has transformed computation, it's transformed miniaturization, transformed so many industries that have actually created a phenomenal degree of progress as a consequence of that, because he was prepared to say, okay, there isn't a limit here. And my point is that we don't know what the limits are today, and that we have the capacity to change all that. Having said that, I have to say to the gentleman who was making a point about happiness, I'm pretty happy.
It does. You pick up anything heavy about the, overuse of resources, questions were asked, and also the chaotic systems.
Yeah, the chaotic systems and a lot of the other questions I think picked up on one very important issue, is that we focus very much on technology and the need for innovation and technology to meet our needs. But what we haven't looked at so much is we know very, very little about the interactions between people and technology. Our understanding about sort of people's psychological reactions to technology, the way that technology affects people's behaviour, the way they adapt their behaviour to meet the technologies that they got, the way that they ask for technologies to meet the behavioural needs they have, is actually really quite sort of poor. It's a poorly developed, this is a very new discipline, and that sort of socio-technical system knowledge is very young, and we need to know that a lot more about that to both understand the needs we have now and to understand the likely needs of people in the future. I mean, when Norman was talking about the way certain technologies explode, and he talked about the way that sort of the car technology created a whole new sort of way of living with a whole new set of needs, obviously that wasn't just because that technology had something intrinsically about it that was made it was bound to set up in that direction. It was about it meeting a sort of a human need and having a part in our life, which meant that it was bound to develop in that way. There's other technical opportunities and options that don't explode in that way. And you hear discussion all the time of, well, in the future, we won't travel as much actually, and all these systems won't be necessary because we'll all be teleconferencing and Skyping and talking remotely. But actually, people have found that technology option, despite being around for some time, hasn't been taken up because we have a natural social need to meet. We have certain psychological and social qualities about us. It means we're not going to take up that sort of technology option because it doesn't meet that human need. So what we really need to understand is the way that our needs and our hopes and the way that we use technologies, the way that the sort of human character of the system and the technological character of the system interrelate, and how they interrelate in a very complex and a very kind of systems level way.
Before we go back out, can I just throw one thing out as well that we haven't touched on apart from, well, maybe tangentially, which is the question of freedom in technology, because it may be the case that Bulgarian protesters against communism were really concerned about pollution. But all over Eastern Europe, people were concerned about freedom, whether they were organising in churches to get rid of Stalinism, or where they were themselves polluting mine workers in Poland. They all wanted more freedom. And I throw that in because somebody made the point about the steam technology, how the Romans never would have invented steam technology. Well, why would you? You had human machines, slaves. Yeah? When you get rid of that and have more human freedom, that drives a need for technology. Why? Because technology gives us more spare time and more choices in the world. And so a world in which there is more freedom has more technology, and that's an important driver that we should consider as well, which is, I'm glad Norman's happy, but I don't sort of care. I do care whether or not Norman is free, and if he's free to make himself unhappy, that's just as valid use of his freedom as anything else. So we can just consider some of that in your next round of contributions. But over there first, and the other mic just here behind the camera. Keep going. That, yeah. Who was it?
Thank you. I'd like to come back
No.
on this.
No. There's a hand over there. Yeah. Stand up. You know who you are. Yeah. That's it. And then when you're finished, tell us. Fine. Okay.
I'm very sorry, by the way. I was wondering, with all this talk of sustainable development and prolonging human life on the Earth, it's all very well and good. And let's say we pick all the right technologies and implement them all in the right way, and we discover all the right things, and we extend our lives here by 100, 200,000 years. Then we hit that 24,000 year cycle, and we either get too close or too far from the sun, as happens from time to time, and completely without our control. Suddenly the Earth's either a snowball or a dust bowl. Is it worth, whilst considering sustainable development, also sinking a decent amount of research and funds into admitting that we can't solve everything, and that at some point we're going to have to get off this rock?
Big ambitions. Yeah. Lady in front. But why not? And here we go.
Well, I wanted to say something in relation to, Norman, you made the point about people being uncomfortable with the future. I think that as part of that, the thing that people are really uncomfortable with is other people. And when you talk about freedom, people are uncomfortable with the idea that people would be free to use new technology. And I think that relates to Shannon's point about the way people fetishize technology. I wasn't in the discussion this morning about 3D printing, but I live in Brooklyn, New York, and we have a lot of 3D printing, new businesses starting up there. And the big discussion is not about the fact that you can now have made to measure. You need a new leg, you can have one. You don't have to pick a size 10 or a size 12. You can pick a size 10.35 if you want. It can be made to measure because of 3D printing. Whereas the whole discussion is about, well, now people can use 3D printing to make arms, to make guns. Aside from the fact that I think that we as Americans should have the right to bear arms, people always assume that with new technology that people are going to use them in a bad way. And I think that's another thing that holds back innovation, because the man at the back talked about, well, we want innovation with, but we want ethical standards. Well, that assumes that there's a common ethical standard. And when people actually talk about ethics, what they actually are talking about is closing down innovation, because the ethics they talk about are usually about environmentalism, sustainability, and and I think that that's one of the problems. There is no common ethical standard that we can all adhere to. So I suppose my underlining point is that the big problem that we face that's holding back innovation is that people are uncomfortable with people, and letting people be free to develop and use new technology, because they always assume the worst.
Okay, we're going to have to put a foot on the pace of change, acceleration to questions, get everybody in. There's lots of hands. So while you're there, Gina, if you could just pass the mic to Dan. There. No, I don't mind who passes it down as long as it goes to the structure. Right. There.
And because come back on the excess of regulation and excess of caution, and I don't know if you know that it's actually in London, the European Agency, and you actually have in that room the Secretary of the Committee on Advanced Therapy. So when it comes to stem cells, they don't grow. Just to comment on the short-term memories of the citizen, because the same people on one day want you to go ahead with those technology, but the same day, if something goes wrong to a child, to the population that he is being tested, the same people will cry out and they will turn to the politicians. So people have to be consequent of what they want. We cannot have everything. So there is a limit to, we need regulation because things can go wrong.
Okay, can I just see hands on this right hand side? Nobody left on this side? Alright. Green mic next to you there. Who's got blue mic? Green mic.
Okay, hello. I keep hearing references to limits and to maintaining our way of life. And it seems to me like it sounds like an equilibrium here, and that we're trying to use technology to establish a static equilibrium, when really perhaps we should embrace the uncertainty and the adversity and perhaps introduce some disequilibrium. I mean, it's what we've been doing as a species since time, I do actually really like that comment about let's get off this rock. That's never going to happen if we don't embrace the fact that technology is actually about adversity, and if anything, increasing technology just increases adversity, and it's sort of like a self-perpetuating problem. And that's actually something that maybe we as a species should embrace, rather than trying to maintain something that doesn't really exist, because our way of life is going to change regardless, because it has been doing so since we were sitting around the fire, basically.
I like this. It's not the great leap forward, it's the great leap off. If you just pass 2 rows back, stick to the left.
I'm not sure technology always has to be sustainable. In the end, things need to be sustainable, because otherwise we won't survive. But individual areas of technology could be unsustainable in the short term. And I think you made the point there, to say everything must be sustainable now. You're going to block some things off. Not least, I'm not sure you can always assess whether something is completely sustainable, because as you point out, you just don't know where it's going to go. And so it may seem to be unsustainable to start off with, and actually turns out to be much more sustainable than you thought later on, for a number of reasons that you didn't understand. And just to point, I think a lot of the simpler questions have been dealt with technologically. I think dealing with the more complex problems is more difficult. I think we've not really got to grips with systems thinking, which everybody seems to think is a simple answer to a posed question. Well, it's much more complicated, maybe chaotic, in which case very difficult to predict. But a lot of systems are predictable if you really look at them, and that's sort of a technology that evolved in the 30s and 40s that we've not really taken to heart. Everybody thinks simple cause and effect will produce something. Systems are much more complex, climate being a good example, and we've not really got to grips with that.
Okay, if you, with the boom arc, work from the back down, if there are any at back, but you may find you end up back in the middle. But I can't see that far before I say that, but boom arc.
Hello. Hi. Thanks everybody for your very interesting comments. I had a question basically about Natasha, one of your very early comments that I thought was a really good one that we haven't really discussed, is that there's not many people in this room who really believe that technology doesn't have an important place in the future. However, one of the real dilemmas is how do we choose which technology is appropriate for the right issue. And I just wanted to sort of see what the rest of the panel thought about how we do decide. Do we let the market do it majoritatively, or do we try and pick winners? Do we need to incubate certain technologies where the incumbent technology is very mature? And how do we go about that, given that, as has been said many times, there's so much uncertainty about knowing what's going to happen? Yeah, so just
okay, no, great. So whoever is at the back, but I can't see.
Hello. I'm minding my own business down in Lewes, Sussex, and I find a sign on the way saying Balcombe, and I find myself in a church hall with 180 deep greens attacking me for being in favour of just giving fracking a little bit of a whirl. And I kind of made a sort of... I made a kind of tentative case that we should experiment with it, even though the conditions geologically are not the same here as they are in America. And before I finished my first sentence, a mother who I took to be a bourgeois in her 50s said, "You want to experiment? You're experimenting on my 6-year-old child." So what Frank Furedi calls the sacralization of the child is something that occurs very much in debates on fracking. So what I want to ask everybody but Norman, because I think everybody but Norman is trying to square the circle and say, okay, we're at the battle of ideas, we better be pro-technology a bit, although we're really running out of resources, and we better not be at all dangerous. I want to ask them two things, which is, what would you say if you were confronted by 180 rabid greens accusing you of, child murder by tentatively suggesting fracking? And secondly, when you look at uncertainty, do you not feel that we can be 90% confident that tomorrow is Sunday, and that we need to be very aware that in the process of new product development, the application of technology, you can never be certain of the results. Just after the end of the Cold War, people were celebrating that fact in a book called Developing Products in Half the Time. By the mid-90s already, people were much more nervous about the uncertainties in new product development. And today, I don't think we're seeing new products develop nearly as much as we should. So can our closet environmentalists on the platform please say, do they really favour new product development with all its risks? Do they accept that lives will be lost as we go for the only ethic that's important, the ethic of progress and less work, as Angus says? Lives will be lost, progress will be made. Is that an ethic they will get behind? Or do they still want to be as certain as environmentalists are that no matter how many resources we're discovering, we're always running out?
Okay, where are the mics? That's the first thing I want to know. Okay, so red shirt there in front, and you'll have nobody at the back. Keep coming until you see a hand. Everybody wants to speak with their hand up. Okay, and that's green mic.
Do you think that part of the problem we have with technology and sustainability and so on is that people on both sides of the debate tend to be quite ill-informed, especially what I notice in the newspapers in this country? You get people on one side denying that climate change is happening and that it's a problem and that resources are running out, and people on the other side denying that possibly wind power isn't the only answer and that maybe nuclear power will have to be involved if we're going to cut carbon and so on. And you find that people don't necessarily know what they're talking about, and the people who do know what they're talking about tend to have a very vested interest one way or the other.
Yes. and Blue Mark. I think that's it, unless there's any sudden last minute. No?
Yeah, I've got a specific question for Martin. I think it's good to hear you recognise that when you're thinking about natural limits, you've also consider what we can do with human ingenuity. But I think you frame that as what we can progress with human ingenuity within the limits and that within natural limits. Why can't we use human ingenuity to overcome those limits? And that if we can, why bother with notions of sustainability? Why not focus on progress?
Okay, so again, huge number of, in the main, very, very good questions. So I'm only really going to give you a minute each to sum up. So what you need to do is give people, make sure you say the one thing that you'd like people to take away with them. And then obviously we'll have opportunities to continue this argument in other fora. Shaheen.
Does sustainability, does technology answer all of requirements for sustainability? There was a comment that we are talking up technology, and I want now to put a bit of a measure in there. No, technology alone doesn't deal with all the requirements of sustainability. I compare it to a case of a person with a ill lifestyle having a heart attack. You need technology to somehow elevate the symptoms, but afterwards you need to change your lifestyle. What do you need to change? Gentleman up there said, we consume, but yet we're not happy. So we shouldn't link the two things together. The gentleman up there was saying in terms of, do we need to sort of develop new products? Yes, we need new products in a way that meets a real need. Do we need the beds that has got a mobile phone into it, a television into it, possibly a bath mixed into it? No, but if there is a right product, yes, we need it. Should we research on getting off this island? I think research on anything is good, providing we do it in a sustainable way.
Now, there's nothing wrong with this island.
Sorry, on this rock. Should we try to get off this rock, providing we do it in a sustainable way? I'm all right.
Natasha.
Yeah, the question about putting your cards on the table and saying, do you accept that developing new technologies will cause people to suffer and die? I mean, at the beginning, I appealed to the principle of double effect. Some things that we do for good cause bad effects, and we appeal to that to justify the bad effects because we're doing something good. So of course we do that, but only if we've got a really good reason to think that the technology we're trying to pursue will have a net benefit, that a lot more people will live better lives or survive because of the technology. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of technology dilemmas. And having worked in philosophy where students battle over and over the questions of things like abortion and euthanasia, so few students outside the realms of technology debate these kind of hard issues around technology. So I'd really like to see these kind of hard ethical questions about the way we introduce technology being discussed more in schools and in universities, because they really are the challenges in the future. And also the issue of how do we choose the right technologies. And I think part of the problem here is that there is no right technology, and if we try and pursue the right technology, then we'll probably end up in stasis too long. And for example, in areas like energy policy, trying to find the perfect solution to our energy needs means that we'll never have a proper energy policy for the future, which means that we won't have enough generation for the future. We might end up in a total catastrophe. We have to find the best solution that we can in the time frame that we need, and that probably won't be the right one, but hopefully it will be as good as we can get.
Okay.
Two very quick ones, or three. Yes, I'm all for getting off this rock, and I don't care whether it's done sustainably or not. I think in the long run, for humanity to sustain itself, we have to build starships. That's the very long run, however. Stem cells, yes, they do need regulation, but over-regulation and highly inappropriate, massively inappropriate regulation is what drives people to go to Korea or China or lots of places where there's less reliable and much less safe procedures. And on the cards on the table question, I don't know what I would say to Greens about fracking, because honestly that's one of these questions that I haven't studied enough. On the other one of nuclear power, which I have, I can give you an example of the kind of answer that I give about that, which is when people ask me about nuclear waste, I say, that's why God made Australia.
recording the Isle of Lewis from that's where I come from.
Martin.
Blimey, there's so much here. What would I do with 180 raving greenies slagging me off for saying I think that fracking could be part of a low carbon energy solution? I'd probably run and hide, because I do think that, and I'm sure they'll disagree with me ferociously. There's a guy up there who's creating a wonderful paper tiger about sustainability, and that sustainability was all about stopping people doing things. It isn't. It is about developing, progressing. That's the core of it. That's why I emphasise it was sustainable development. I'm not too sure about that sort of, never mind the people, progress above all else. That sounded slightly like creating a sort of Ubermensch. I think the disequilibrium side of things is interesting. Look, we'll have disequilibrium whether we like it or not. We don't have to worry about creating disequilibrium. We don't have to worry about should we not create more uncertainty. We live in gloriously uncertain times, and I hope it will bring out the best in us. Somebody talked about systems. Absolutely, systems thinking is at the core of ecology, which lies behind all this stuff. So I think seeing things as part of a system is absolutely vital, and I quite agree. It does often make it tricky to have neat, tight answers. End of the world as we know it, and getting off this rock. I think the sort of science fiction fan inside me is thrilled at the growing evidence of habitable planets elsewhere and the growing likelihood of intelligent life elsewhere. And so I speculate that perhaps we are coming to the end in sort of, whatever sort of spatial time of ourselves as species, and we may start merging other species, and then whole new adventures will ensue. Who knows?
Good things have to come to an end.
Yes. I thought that the point that was made about this equilibrium and disequilibrium is a very key point, because I think this point that I'm trying to make about uncertainty and about what really underpins the concerns behind sustainable development is there is this assumption that there is this kind of equilibrium to be achieved, and that the variable in this, nature, is in this kind of state of equilibrium. And we as human beings are the variable that is negatively impacted on nature. It's fallacious for two reasons. One, because nature is not in equilibrium. If you want to see a natural system that's in equilibrium, look at the moon. It's dead. Nature, where did we come from? Human beings. If the nature was in equilibrium, we would never have emerged in the first place. And the difference between us and everything else is that we've got consciousness, that we can consciously understand and plan. And nature has created wonderful trees that are hundreds of feet high, but look what man has done. We have built buildings that are 5,000 times bigger than that are etc. And so my point is that if you're looking for equilibrium, you're looking in the wrong place, and you essentially what you're doing, the only way you can achieve that is by limiting mankind and limiting human ingenuity, and that's a real problem, because the right technology, as people have asked, it depends on what problem you solve and how you frame that problem and how you see the potential possibilities around that. So about getting off the rock, there is more water surrounding the sun on comets that could probably support trillions of people. We haven't yet worked out how we can capture that water. So all this problem about the natural limits of water in the future and the concerns about wars over water and all that, we could solve that problem if that really was the issue that confronted us, and now we required solutions to that. And it really comes down to the fundamental proposition. The opportunity is that mankind is a problem solver, and that's what we have to hold on to, even when we are faced with a lot of pessimism by the skeptics. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you all very much. There's another half an hour break to spend in the lift. Dreaming of faster ways to get around.